In your textbook, Professor Lockwood has already mentioned some of the ways that Beethoven's music figured in late 19th century and 20th century politics and culture. For our last session, I'd like to provide a brief overview of Beethoven's lasting influence in 19th century Europe. The decades after Beethoven's death saw the founding of permanent civic orchestras, starting in cities such as Leipzig and Berlin and spreading worldwide. Beethoven's middle period symphonies have always been central to the repertoire. Pick any major city today, look at their orchestra's programming for the season, and you're bound to find at least one Beethoven symphony on the agenda, and perhaps two or three. You might recall that before Beethoven, the symphony was considered a form of light entertainment. Mozart wrote 41 of them, and surely would have written many more if he hadn't died young. Haydn wrote 104. Beethoven transformed the symphony into something much more complex and monumental, writing only 9. From then on, few composers wrote more than that. They felt obliged to meet or exceed the standard of length and depth set by Beethoven. Johannes Brahms famously took 21 years to write his first symphony because of the pressure he felt to produce nothing less than a masterpiece on his very first attempt. In his entire life, he wrote only 4. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky wrote only 6. Antonin Dvorak, Anton Bruckner, and Gustav Mahler each wrote only 9. Several of Mahler's symphonies include a chorus and solo singers, just as Beethoven did in his 9th. Another orchestral genre that Beethoven influenced for years to come is the concert overture. You may recall that his overtures to Coriolanus and Egmont are self-contained, single-movement works that follow the sonata allegro form template, and which reflect dramatic contrasts from a literary source. After Beethoven's death, many Romantic composers with a literary bent wrote similar pieces. Notable examples include Felix Mendelssohn's overture The Hebrides, Opus 26, also known by the title Fingal's Cave, Robert Schumann's Manfred overture, which arose from incidental music for Lord Byron's dramatic poem, and Tchaikovsky's overture fantasy Romeo and Juliet. Around the middle of the 19th century, this genre was rebranded by the pianist and composer Franz Liszt. He coined the new label symphonic poem, which appealed to the Romantic interest in uniting different art forms. The most spectacular symphonic poems came later in the century, after the expansion of the orchestra to incorporate a greater variety of instrumental sounds. Richard Strauss built his career on a series of brilliant tone poems inspired by literary subjects including Don Juan, Don Quixote, and even the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zoroaster. Liszt studied the piano with Carl Czerny, who in turn had studied with Beethoven. In the 1830s, Liszt heard the Italian violinist Niccolò Paganini, who redefined the limits of what a human being could play on the violin. Liszt resolved to do likewise with the piano, and composed a series of transcendental studies to transcend the traditional limits of what a human being could play on the piano. These pieces thereby continue and extend the Beethovenian image of the pianist as a romantic hero struggling against impossible odds, or in this case, impossible notes. Beethoven's efforts to reform opera and naturalize it for Germans were continued by Carl Maria von Weber, and then, most famously, by Richard Wagner. In the Italian tradition of musical theater, one of the central goals had always been to create hit tunes, which tend to fall into regular, symmetrical phrases with clear, intelligible cadences. Wagner sought to generate a longer line of continuity as part of creating a more coherent musical work, a totally integrated artwork, or Gesamtkunstwerk. He did this in part by assigning an individual musical theme called a leading motive, or leitmotif, to each of the principal characters, to important inanimate objects like swords, magic helmets, or the Holy Grail, and even to abstract ideas such as a curse, or lust, or redemption through love. He applied Beethoven's ideas of motivic unity and continuous development to weave a complex musical web in which the orchestra doesn't just accompany the singers, but often comments on what they're singing, reminding us of characters or objects that are not actually on stage at that moment. Wagner's ideas dominated debates about music and the fine arts in the late 19th century and even in the early 20th. There are probably more books and articles written about Wagner than about any other composer, with the possible exception of Mozart. Yet, even at the turn of the 20th century, when new technologies and new ideas were radically changing people's everyday lives, Beethoven still loomed large over the cultural landscape. One measure of this is the exhibition mounted in Vienna in 1902 by a group of avant-garde artists known as the Vienna Secession. Their name derives from their break with the established conservative artists association, the Viennese Artists' House. This exhibition centered on the figure of Beethoven, literally through a monumental sculpture of the composer created by Max Klinger and located at the center of the exhibition hall, and figuratively in an adjacent room where the artist Gustav Klimt had painted an allegorical series of images inspired by Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. These artworks vividly illustrate the power that Beethoven's life story and musical works still exerted 75 years after his death.